Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Sunday Forum for October 3rd. And just a very quick digression before we go any further. And that is that today also happens to be the day that Woody Guthrie died. And I have a lyric, a verse here from This Land Is Your Land, one of his most famous songs. And not many people know about this verse, but it happens to deal directly with immigrants. And so it seemed like a good connection. The verse states, "There was a big high wall there that tried to stop me. Sign was painted, it said private property, but on the backside, it didn't say nothing. This land was made for you and me." So that seems to me to be a pretty good introduction to a talk on immigration law. And with us this morning, we have Graham Ojala-Barbour, who is, among other things, a member of Plymouth Church, but also has been active in immigration law in Minnesota for some time, and is going to be sharing with us this morning some of his experiences with that. And so, Graham, we are thrilled to have you. Before I turn it over to you, just a couple of quick comments about using Zoom for people who may not be familiar with it. And we use the Q&A button. So if you have a question that you would like to ask Graham, and please feel free to raise questions at any point, and we'll try to work them in as we go along. So happy to take questions whenever. So if you want to type in your question, you can type it in the Q&A button. If you want to actually ask a question out loud and have a conversation with Graham, we encourage that also. And so there's a raise your hand feature. And if you raise your hand, Myra Starkenberg and I will be monitoring that, and we'll let people know how it will work you into the conversation when we see that you've raised your hand. So those are the options there. There's also a chat feature, and we ask that you not use that for questions about the presentation or during the presentation. The chat is if you're having technical difficulties, you can send a note to our technical staff. Also, if you want to send a note to other participants, if you want to have a side conversation, chat allows you to do that as well. So with that, let's be done with the technical lead-ins and turn it over to Graham to hear about an immigration lawyer's perspective on immigration. Thank you, Graham.
Thank you, John. And thank you all for coming to listen and for inviting me to speak about immigration law. I am an immigration lawyer in private practice in St. Paul, in Highland. I have my office in Highland neighborhood. And I'm going to talk some about policy generally and some of my thoughts about what should be done. But also it's sort of mostly grounded in my experience practicing law. So I'm coming from the perspective not of a statistician or policymaker or researcher, but as a lawyer who's helping immigrants to try to normalize their status or to not be deported, and the things that I've seen. So just to give you sort of a brief kind of like outline of what I want to talk about today. First, I'm going to talk about some of the experiences that I see undocumented people having in our community, and especially as it pertains to the law, and sort of essentially highlighting some of the difficulties and lack of rights and benefits that people have, although they're living here. And then second, I'm going to talk about some of the pathways that I try to use to help folks, but I'm going to highlight that they're extremely limited, that only certain types of people or certain categories of people are able to use these pathways. And there's a lot of people who unfortunately don't have the benefit of being able to benefit from the laws that exist. And I'm going to use that to tie into basically my broader point is that I think the pathway to citizenship needs to be expanded in order to include more people who have lived and contributed for a long time here. And I want to acknowledge also, I think maybe kind of the elephant in the room of all this is going to be what's happening at the border. I'm a lawyer here in Minnesota. I'm not there. I'm going to just that's not going to be the focus of my talk, but I do want to share my sort of opinion about that, I guess. In some of a couple just ideas, I think, is what I'm going to share about my thoughts about the border. One is that first I'll say it's a huge problem that I think doesn't have an easy solution. Just like to what extent the border is going to be, there are a lot of people trying to come to this country, and how many, who can come, are complicated questions. I think that the way that this is played out, like in the media recently, has unfortunately sort of provided a distraction from the need for immigration reform within the country. So 12 million people are living in the United States or more without status, some for decades. And we were hopeful that a new administration and legislature would allow for legislation that would help at least some of these people. And the crisis, at the border has sort of been a distraction from anyone's ability to do that. In my experience with talking with legislators, I'm a part of a group of immigration lawyers that talks to legislators at least once a year about our desire for and advocating for reform. And hard line from especially the Republicans has been just, we need to figure out the border first. And it's sort of like, we need to solve an impossible problem before we can even talk about finding anything, for folks who are here. So another thing is just, there are these images that we see of total chaos kind of at the border. I mean, like the New York Times this morning on the front page there's an article about people crossing through a jungle coming from South America, and the images recently, it is sort of disturbing this, but it's like there actually is a lot of law enforcement at the border and there is, this process. And I guess I'm just acknowledging that it is a big problem in the sense that there's no easy solution, but I hope that we can move also beyond that and think about folks who are actually here. And that's what my talk is going to focus on, although I've sort of allowed it to get sidetracked as the Republicans have been doing, the border's a problem, we can't talk about anything else. So here's everything else. Folks who are here, I'm gonna try to illustrate with some stories. One sort of law that I think is kind of shocking to someone's conscience who doesn't know a lot about this is that we have this concept of being innocent until proven guilty. But for folks who are not here with papers, if they're arrested by ICE, so someone arrested by immigration authorities in Minnesota, although they may have been here for 20 years or more, has the burden of proof to show that they are not a danger in order to be released from immigration custody. So in every other legal context, the state or the government has the burden of proof to basically, like, to detain someone. The state in every other context has to show that there's a reason this person should be detained, that there's a reason they're dangerous and they should be detained. Immigrants who are here without status have the burden to show that they are not a danger. So it's difficult to prove a negative, prove that you're not a danger. So I have had clients, for example, who are arrested by the police for a crime and then immediately transferred to ICE custody. And then even without being charged by a prosecutor, can be held by ICE. And when we ask the immigration judge for them to be released, we have to show that they're not a danger. And then it becomes relevant. Well, why did you get arrested by the police? Okay. And the police maybe won't release the report. It's a pending investigation or something. I mean, if it's a pending investigation, the police won't release the report. Generally, the prosecutor is reviewing the charges. It hasn't been charged. There's no charges, but my client is in jail. In Minnesota, ICE detains people at county jails. So there are counties, among them are Sherburne County is one of the biggest. Candiothe County is Wilmer. Those are a couple of the biggest ones. Carver County in Chaska does this. And Freeborn County, Albert Lee. The county jails in those counties have contracts with ICE to hold people. And okay, so my client's in jail and we're asking for the bond to be released on a bond, but we can't get the police report. There's no charges. And that's a difficult jam that people are in. And it's kind of absurd. I mean, another thing that happens is, people often are released from, it also happens that people are charged, let's say it's with a DUI or something like that, can be like a misdemeanor, or maybe they got in a fight or something. So it's the kind of thing where if you get arrested on a Friday, you're going to be out of jail by month. The state court judge releases people, no problem. You pay a bail or something. You have court in 2 months, but bam, ICE arrests you if you're not, if you don't have papers. Okay, now you have to prove you're not a danger. And the immigration judge is looking, the state court judge has already determined that you can be released. But the immigration judge now you have to prove to the immigration judge that you're not a danger in order to be released again. And it's especially ridiculous, I think, when there's no charges. But even when there is, my clients all the time are like, well, I already did I already did that. I already paid the bond. It's like, well, no, this is a new bond. This is a new bail. This is a new judge. And it's a different regime of laws. And the laws are not generous. And on the contrary, I've already said this 3 times, but you have to prove you're not a danger, which, okay, but as a lawyer, it's completely different kind of standard. And especially when the documents aren't available, it's you're guilty until you prove you're innocent, basically. So it sort of goes against our fundamental notion of due process. Okay, so that's one thing that undocumented folks deal with. And they've seen often, friends, coworkers, cousins, parents be deported under those conditions. Okay, so then one other thing that happened to me recently, or a story, happened to me. I was a lawyer talking to my client, and she lived for many, many years in the United States without status, 20 years, okay, working. It's very common that people work with an invented social security number. So, it's not that there are many different things that happen, but a very common thing is that somebody just invents a number to give to an employer. And what does that mean? That means they're on their payroll, they're paying into the social security system, but they don't have a social security number to take anything out. Okay. So for decades. And then now I was talking to this woman who is in her 60s, and we were able to finally get her, she's now applying for citizenship. She was able to get a green card. She was a victim of a crime. And there's a law that, there's a benefit called a U visa, which enables folks who are the victim of crime who cooperate with law enforcement or a prosecutor to get a U visa. So it sort of eventually allows them to get a green card, because Congress realized that we need people to be reporting crimes when they're a victim. We don't want undocumented people to not be able to tell the police if they're the victim of a crime. It makes sense from a public safety. So this person who I'm talking about was able to benefit from that law. And now we're applying for her citizenship. And she was talking to me about, she's still working. She's in her 60s. She wants to retire, but she doesn't have, although she paid into the Social Security system for decades, she doesn't get any Social Security. So those are just a couple examples of things that I wanted to tell you about what I see undocumented people dealing with, although they've been here contributing to our economy for so many years. Okay. So what can I do as a lawyer for people to help them? I mentioned the U visa in the context of a crime victim, but people who are fortunate enough to not be the victim of really serious crimes can't benefit from that. So what can we do? For people who are put into removal proceedings, there's an application that sometimes we can make called cancellation of removal. That requires that you've been in the US for 10 years before removal proceedings, and that you have a child, spouse, or parent who either has a green card or who's born here, who will suffer an exceptional or extremely unusual hardship if you are deported. So it's not enough, and this is like codified in the regulations, and I've heard the immigration judge tell people, I mean, it is not enough to be a typical family separated by deportation. You need to show an exceptional or extremely unusual hardship. So what does that mean? It means like a life-threatening or serious medical condition on the part, and not like if you have the medical condition, that's not enough. It has to be your US citizen child, or if you're married to a person who is also undocumented, their hardship doesn't count. It's only the US citizen's hardship. So the child, like you need to have a child with a very serious, exceptional or extremely unusual hardship. So it's like, this isn't like just that it's going to be difficult, or even financial problems. It's not enough that you are the only one working and that your spouse doesn't work because she's taking care of the 3 kids. That's not enough. It has to be like medical or serious, like psychological or behavioral problem where you can show that this is. So my point is, we're not handing out green cards to folks without some exceptional circumstances. Asylum also is like something that we do a lot of applications for, but like I'm telling my folks who are hiring me, this is extremely difficult. This is not only is it not a guarantee, it's the law is so restrictive. The asylum law is so restrictive. And it's been, in my opinion, this is my opinion, but it's particularly for folks from Central America and Mexico. Like we have a lot of people coming from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, fleeing gang violence. And the MS-13 and some of these criminal organizations are so powerful and have infiltrated essentially the state of like El Salvador. But the asylum law does not provide protection to people who are fleeing that kind of violence, even if they've been seriously harmed, unless you can show that it's connected to one of the 5 protected grounds for bases for asylum law. So it's not enough to show that you'll be killed by the gang. You have to show that they're going to kill you because of your race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So if you're, a 17-year-old or 18-year-old who the gang is saying, we're going to kill you because you're not willing to sell drugs for us, and even if you've been cut your arm by a machete, and they're threatening you and your family, you don't get asylum unless you can show that it's because of one of these protected grounds. You're from Honduras. It's not because of your race. because probably you're Hispanic. It's not because of your religion, because, I mean, almost, we're talking about a Christian country where the gang isn't persecuting people because of their religion, generally speaking. It's not because of politics. It's not because of nationality, because you're from Honduras. So what does it mean to be a member of a particular social group? And that a lot of lawyers and a lot of smart lawyers have done a lot of litigation arguing about what does that mean, because that's where we have some room. But the decision makers have decided that being a person who refuses to join the gang, that doesn't count. That's not a particular social group under the asylum law. So this is all to say, the asylum law does not provide protection to people who can show their lives are in danger, unless it can be connected with these protected grounds, which have been carved out to exclude them. So all this to say, there's no easy path. We really try, and we really need a new law. I think that so this is sort of more like my opinion now, but well, I guess I want to just thinking historically for a moment, like, what does it mean to be a citizen? I think it's a useful thing to consider. It's like, what does it mean to be a citizen of the United States? Well, it used to mean that you were a white person, I mean, a free white person. Like, slaves were not citizens. The definition of citizenship was expanded by the 14th Amendment to include freed slaves. And so I guess, and now the law provides for naturalization. So someone who has a green card or who is a permanent resident can apply for citizenship 5 years after they get their green card. Okay. And they have to show, that they have been a person of good moral character and other things. But the thing that so if you can get a green card, in other words, you can eventually become a citizen if you want to. So where we have a bottleneck, or the problem though, is we need a way for people to be able to get a green card or to become a permanent resident. I mean, so when we talk about a pathway to citizenship, it's not even at the stage of becoming a citizen that we have the jam. We're talking about, like, from having nothing or no papers or no permanent resident status to having that. That's where we need a huge jump forward. And then when people have a green card, they may decide whether or not they want to become a citizen. And that's a decision that is, complicated. And, I'm sure we all know folks who, or, I know people who have decided not to, although, like, maybe a Canadian who just for whatever reason just decides, or someone from another country has their green card, but they may not want to become a US citizen. But there are a lot of people who do want to become US citizens, who have been contributing for decades, who can't even get a green card. And not only that, they can't even get a driver's license. Because there's this sort of, and I think there's this kind of criminalization of being an undocumented immigrant. And I mean, the sort of, I mean, I don't have to tell you guys that the sort of right-wing drum beating of, well, you broke the law, so you got to go. But if you even spend 17 seconds, I mean, let alone minutes, thinking about it, it's like there is absolutely no possible logistical way that we can deport the people who live in this country without papers. I mean, a few, yes, like to the extent that there can be fear can be wreaked through the community. But as a practical matter, people are here to stay, they're working, and by the way, we need people to work. I mean, I don't know if you've noticed that everywhere is hiring, and it's like we've got a border crisis. Well, it's sort of a little bit manufactured crisis in order to divert the attention from this. People who we need to be working cannot even get a driver's license, let alone a social security number. I mean, to even be able to like benefit from their own contributions. So yeah, I guess, you know, that's kind of my 2 cents. I mean, I can talk more about the details of the legal, you know, aspects of this, but I think I'd like to know if people, you know, have any questions for me. I can, otherwise I'll kind of keep, oops, I'm just accidentally raised my own hand as I'm trying to.
So Graham, I would like to second what you just said and encourage people to type in questions into Q&A or raise your hand, and we'll look for questions either way there. Just to start things off, thinking about this from the point of view of needing employees. I mean, is there some of these people who need employees are Republicans?
Yeah.
And they've been essentially forced to break the law in many cases to get the help that they need. Are they okay with it? Is there any room there to get support for immigration reform in terms of providing employees that the country needs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that goes to something really important, which I'll try to illustrate with the story. I guess, I mean, first of all, I mean, I guess to cut to the point, I think the Republicans, like, let's say if I were a Republican congressperson, you know, I would be afraid to support immigration because a lot of the Republican part, the sort of base or the more right-wing part of the party, which is quite powerful, is vitriolically opposing like the candidacy of Republican candidates who are pro-immigrant. So, you know, even I think the Republicans are afraid of their own party in that regard. When I was last year, was it last year only that we had an election for president? We were trying to, I was involved with trying to raise some money for pro-immigrant candidates and like a PAC that was supporting pro-immigrant candidates. And I was talking to people about that. And there's a guy, a lawyer in town named Sam Myers, who's been around for a long time in town here. And he told me a story about, he said basically there was a congressperson, a congressman in, I think he was in Michigan, who was a Republican, kind of a moderate, who was pro-immigrant. And he just got completely attacked by his own party, sort of labeled as like, almost like supporting terrorists or something, you know what I mean? It's like, it's just, they kind of get slammed, and I think that's part of the problem. I mean, the other thing that I alluded to before is just constant focus on the border as like, we need to do that first, you know? And there's been a lot of sort of horse trading around, well, maybe we can do, you know, maybe we can do DACA if we can like build the wall, or what, you know, or other, and like 3 other kind of heinous things that the pro-immigrant folks are never going to agree with. So it becomes an impossible sort of kind of negotiation. Another thing that made me think about is that many times I've talked to people who are shocked by when they find out what the law is. Like, for example, maybe like a dairy farmer or sort of like small employer whose employee gets picked up by ICE. So maybe, you know, a Mexican guy who's been working at a dairy farm for 10 years is a great employee, great guy, good dad. Okay. His employer calls and he got arrested for a DUI and now he's in ICE custody. And what can we do about it? Can I help? yes, I can help. And I explain like kind of the regime and what's the rule and how's it going to go. And they're always shocked because they're like, well, wait, but he's not one of these bad illegal people. Like, he's a good guy. He's been here and it's like, right. But the law is brutal and he doesn't, it's like, he doesn't have papers. So this applies to him too. Like, it's like, and it's the same thing from people's spouses, from people, it's like, I talk to people and they're shocked when they hear what the situation actually is. And it's the common refrain is like, but he or she is not like that. They're not like them. It's like, well, but who is them? It's like,
Right. Graham, thank you. We've got a couple more questions here. We've got just one to kind of go back to the kind of the immigration 101 or even pre 101. Okay.
yeah.
Can you explain more about how immigration is a civil law and how that is different from criminal law?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So there is, the criminal, there's different sections of law in like the US code. First of all, immigration law is federal. So, and criminal law is both federal and state law. So there's federal laws, and that's when, the feds, the FBI or the US attorney are enforcing the federal law criminally. Whereas like, typically if you get charged with like a DUI or something like that, that's a state, you'll mean a state court. Immigration law, the immigration court here in Minnesota is in Fort Snelling in a federal building, which is it's called the Whipple building, and it's a big building. It's kind of like at where 62, or where if you're on 5 coming from St. Paul, 62 goes that way, or the airport. It's kind of close to the airport by the river, and so it's on federal land, and it's the U.S. Department of Justice oversees the immigration court system, and the law is the Immigration and Nationality Act is the federal law that sort of is like the statutory regime. There are criminal laws that are implicated in it, but it's sort of like a connection rather than the same thing. So there is a federal crime for illegal re-entry after deportation. So if someone gets deported and then comes back illegally, the law enforcement in anywhere, but probably be more often at the border, that it gets charged out as a federal crime to illegally re-enter after deportation. And if you're like a drug trafficker, or if you've been convicted of a serious crime, the penalty is like maximized, or what do you call it? It's like I'm forgetting the legal term of art for enhanced. It's like an enhanced sentence for if you've been so. But the immigration law itself is not a criminal law; it's a civil law. So, and it has both like benefits and bars. So like, it lays out who can get a green card and how, and it lays out who's deportable and why. And it's changed, over the years in a lot of ways that are beyond the scope of this conversation. But it used to be explicitly racist and like targeting specific ethnic groups and nationalities, like most explicitly. First was like there was a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act. I guess you can't do that anymore, but that was like actually one of the first sort of, for the first 100 years of the nation's history, there was no restriction on who could come to the United States. And so it's, to think about it historically does sort of open, or at least for me, it's sort of interesting to think about, like, because it reflects that these things can change. It's not static. And I think that the question of what are we going to do is complicated, but I'm not, and people are like, well, we can't just let everybody in, or of course not, but the line is drawn somewhere right now, and it's drawn too far to one side, and it needs to move. So I guess I'll just I'll take more questions, but I also
Yep.
wanted to just address the one idea, which is like, people often will ask at the end of this kind of things like, well, what should I do, or what can I do? And I don't have any easy answers, but I will tell you that like the church generously offered an honorarium for my speaking, which I've decided that would be donated to a group called the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota, which is a nonprofit in St. Paul that both does direct representation of immigrants who need legal help, and they also do advocacy for reform, and both are needed. And so to support places like Immigrant Law Center is one thing, and also to support pro-immigrant candidates and to let your legislators know that you care about this issue, I think are some of the most sort of like important and also accessible ways to be on the right side of this, as I see it. So
Graham, I put the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota link in the chat, so people feel free to get that link to their website. Ira, did you have a question you would like to ask? You're on mute.
For a while, Plymouthites were carpooling over to the Fort Snelling for the hearings or whatever you call them. And is that still possible to do?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. You know that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
it is. COVID has changed some things, but it's still happening. So they limit the number of, well, there's a few different ways. Like there's a group that is involved in being court observers. So like some folks actually go into the hearings and are kind of like taking notes and reporting to the Advocates for Human Rights is another great organization that that I support and that helps organize that group of volunteers who are court observers. So that's one thing, but like, and that's still happening, but because of the pandemic, they have limited like the number of people who can be in the courtroom. And then there are also, kind of like more like protest and vigil type events that happen there at Fort Snelling. So,
And Graham, we participate in that every month.
okay, cool. Yeah.
So, yep. Thanks for that. Okay. Graham, one more question here. Is there a practical reason we can't use electronics rather than incarceration to keep track of people who are now being imprisoned by ICE?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess one answer is we do that to a certain degree. But like normally with, when I say we, I mean like the government. But it's done not in the context of like someone who's been here typically who gets arrested, but rather like people who come to the border are often released with an ankle bracelet that has a tracking device. And there's a private, this is a very weird like sort of subsection of what I sometimes have to deal with is like there's a group, the acronym is ISAP, which is like also absurdly sounds similar to ICE. It's like my clients will tell me like it's like ICE and ISAP. Okay, ISAP is like this supervision. It's a it's a program of a company in this kind of weird office park in Bloomington across from the 494 from the airport. And basically ICE contracts with this company to supervise people, usually who are first arriving. So like who have recently come to the country, they have an ankle bracelet, they have to be home, like they'll give this kind of requirements, like on Tuesday at noon, you have to be home to take our call on your landline, you know, and so they have to do this like supervision program. So there is, I guess, to answer you like directly, like why can't we do that? Like they do that, but the immigration judge, like dealing with someone who just got arrested for a crime, even if they haven't been charged, has to go through this analysis of, can you prove you're not a danger, you know? And so, I mean, like, there are people who are released, just for example, because at the border, they only have so many beds where they can detain people. So people who they're not able to deport, they will release them, and sometimes on an ankle bracelet. But the detention machine, though, has just been ballooning, even though, like, as you're pointing out, those tools do exist, but they're often not used, especially when there's any kind of indication of like any criminal activity, even if it's not charged, even if it's just an accusation, you know, kind of thing.
Graham, another question. Can you give an example of are there any other civil laws for which people are detained or locked up other than
Yeah. Well, like, so sex offender stuff, I mean, like, or mental commitment, you know, I think would be an example. I mean, like,
those are civil crimes, not criminal?
well, no, you're right. I mean, like, let's say, but like, so there's a distinction, there's a point at which it becomes civil. So like, for example, like a sex crime is a criminal offense.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe somebody goes to prison, or maybe they get probation or whatever, but like maybe they finish their prison term. Okay. And then there's still like, there are like, this has been litigated. I mean, this is not my area, but like there was a lawsuit in Minnesota where people were suing the state because they were basically indefinitely held, right? Because they were deemed a danger to others,
Okay.
even after their prison term was over or something. Okay. But in that context, at least the state would have to prove that they're a danger. I mean, it's not like, you know, prove you're not a sex offender. That doesn't happen. It's like you already been found guilty by a jury of that. And there's like a psychosexual evaluation that you had to do with a psychiatrist. I mean, it's not like we just lock people up for that for no reason. I mean, like, I will say for the immigration side, like, it's, you know, from the standpoint of Congress and the law enforcement, it's like, it's not for no reason. They have no status. And then this is what the law says. In order to be released, you have to prove you're not a danger. I mean, it kind of could make sense as like, okay, criminal immigrants is not a very sympathetic class of folks. But when you get into the nitty gritty of how does that play out? Well, even if you're, you know, arrested with no charge or an allegation, I mean, we have found over centuries, you know, if you go back to like the common law in England, that we believe in due process and that people should have a chance to, you know, rebut these allegations or like face their accuser. And that doesn't carry over here. So there are sort of analogies in civil law, but they're not very analogous, you know, in other way. I mean, there is other forms of civil detention or commitment, but it's not the same rules applying. So I think it's 10. Is it 10:45?
Yes.
So that means
So Graham,
that I've said enough words.
Graham, this is the point at which you have to imagine that you are being wildly applauded People are saying thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise with us. Very much appreciated. And so I just,
Thank you.
okay, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Okay, take care.
Yep. And we want to talk about what we have coming up next week. And unfortunately, I'm sorry, I don't have that information in front of me. Myra, do you have that handy? I don't. I'm sorry. Oh dear.
I'll look, let me see if I can.
Okay.
find-
Hang on one second. Maybe I can go find it quick.
I can speak to
Here we
that.
go. Here we go. Next week, toward an equitable, renewable energy future. Lisa Daniels, Executive Director and founder of Windustry, will be giving us a presentation on an equitable, renewable energy future. So that's what we have coming up next week. And again, thank you all for being here with us this morning. And with that, we are done with our program. And thanks, everybody.